Daniel 2. Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell them what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magicians or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men." This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king."
Then Daniel went to Arioch, and the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him." Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dreams mean." The king's name Daniel, also called Belshazzar. "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions have passed away through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind returned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretations and that you may understand what went through your mind. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thigh of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on the feet of its iron and clay and smashed it. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were broken into pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was a dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and glory and power. Might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with the baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will remain united, and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will also endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of the kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler of the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court.
Before we begin, how about I just pray for us? Our Father, we pray now as we look at your word this morning. We ask that as we work through this passage, that we'll be both encouraged and challenged by what we see here, and it'll help us to think about how we in our life are using the opportunities that you give us to bring glory to you and to point people towards your gospel of salvation. Amen. So as you know, we started looking at this book of Daniel last week that looks at a time of God's people living in exile of this land of Babylon. That after Judah's rejection of God and then their fall deeper into sin, how they were then conquered by this powerful and this ruthless empire that's parted them off into exile so that the nation could reset itself. And that one day, out of this exile, a faithful remnant of them could return to their homeland and worship God once more. With all that corruption now gone, they would go back to doing what God asked them to do. As explained last week, each chapter of this book now gives a short record of events that happened during this exile in Babylon, where Daniel, or what is his other faithful friends, they're given a challenging situation that they've got to work through. That they'll often be faced with what is a choice of choosing to live for God by proclaiming him and his ways, or giving into the ways of the culture they're in order to avoid being persecuted. That an option was always there where they could choose to live a quiet life by simply going along with the surrounding culture so as to avoid bringing attention to their faith. But as we see, as we look at this book, they never choose the latter there. They never do that. But they always remain faithful no matter what that might cost them, which is why as we're going through Daniel chapter by chapter, looking at each event and doing this so we can see how God's faithful people are able to deal with situations like this by looking at the choices they made and why they made it, what was driving them to stay faithful. And that way we can learn from them. We can actually sort of imitate the way they were able to face a hostile culture and not give in to temptation. So today, as we look at chapter 2, we get what is the first real test that Daniel will have to face that, if handled correctly and handled faithfully, will open the door for Daniel to have what is a special place in this empire. That if he really trusts God, he'll be able to survive the danger that he's in, as God is going to be there with him, helping him along the way. And that is why, as we look at this, we really do see God working all through this event. That it's not just Daniel who will succeed by what is his amazing hard work, but it's only by God giving him what is special gifts, and also God giving Daniel the opportunity to use those special gifts in how Daniel's going to get through this. Hence why Daniel, all he has to do is have faith in God and trust in him and be prepared to grab the opportunities when they do come. To not run from them or to be blind and unaware of them even being there, but to keep his eyes open to the doors that God is opening for him and trusting in God enough to then just walk through it. And looking at events like this and how Daniel deals with them raises some challenges for ourselves. As mentioned last week, the idea of Babylon in the Bible was that it was not just a physical place, but it is seen as a place of pride and sin and the rejection of God and his people. That whilst it existed as an actual empire, and Daniel in this book is in an actual place at a specific time that is recorded in real world history and as talked about in our focus segment, we've got artifacts from that time that show this is real, this place was real, this stuff happened. Well, beyond that, Babylon also symbolizes those who reject God and persecute those who have their faith in him. And as we are in many ways living in what is a symbolic and modern day Babylon, as Western society these days also rejects God's ways and is also becoming all the more hostile to those who continue to proclaim his ways. Well, this then raises a challenge for us in how we are to take the opportunities that God gives us to proclaim his word and also to glorify him. It raises a question for us that when faced with a hostile society, will we confidently profess our faith and point towards God as a foundation of our strength? Or will we avoid the conflict? Or if we do face it, even take the credit ourselves when navigating the challenges of this world? How do we approach these problems we have when living in a symbolic Babylon? And that's a test for us here. That's a challenge for us here. When faced with difficulty, do we in faith take the opportunities given to glorify God, or do we just simply choose to live a quiet life and deny our relationship with him altogether? So with those questions in mind, looking at the passage now, we see in just the first few verses the issues that will need to be dealt with by Daniel and his friends here. That like all the chapters in the first half of this book, there's always some major problem that they're having to face. And this one is going to be in regards to something what is disturbing the king. The king's desperately worried about something. So it says in verse 1, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So there's a problem that is going to need to be solved. The king keeps having these dreams that he can't understand, and that, as we'll find out as we read on, these dreams are more than just some random thoughts that he's been having, but that God himself is actually behind them. that God is giving the king these revelations, but they're coming in the form of a dream, and that dream needs to be decoded, deciphered. So because of these dreams that the king is having, it then says here, so the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. So that there simply is the problem. The dreams are disturbing him, and he's asked the people who have special abilities in dealing with dreams. That's what their job is. That's why they have these high places in the empire. He's asking them, decode this for me. Help me to understand this one. Decipher it so I know what's going on. I need to know what this dream is all about, because this dream is really disturbing the king to the point that he can't even sleep at night. It's tormented him. So with that being the issue, we then read on as to what these people are going to do about this. How are they going to deal with this dilemma? So it says here in verse 4, then the astrologers answered the king. And this is where we're going to get their response to this challenge. But before we look at what this is, how they respond, there is something important to be pointed out. We need to take a little bit of a sidetrack here, a bit of a detour from what is the rest of the sermon, basically. Because I mentioned when we were talking about this series at the start, saying we're going to be looking at Daniel this term, I mentioned how there are some unique things in this book in regards to how it's structured, and now we actually get to that point. Something important is going on here in the background. Something interesting is happening here, and how this book was written, and it's worth spending a few minutes talking about it. So as you probably know, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Now, that's the language of the Israelites, of the Jews. We obviously read it all in English today, having had it translated from the original language, but Hebrew is what the Old Testament is mostly written in. And I say mostly because there are some parts written in Aramaic. It is not all Hebrew, even if the majority of it is. Ezra, for example, has a couple of passages written in this other language, as does some other verses here and there throughout other books. And even in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, we see again that Aramaic pops up from time to time. It was a common language during that time as well. It's why Jesus calls out from the cross in Aramaic. And even in our English translations today, we still actually have it recorded in Aramaic before we get told what it means, before we then get the translation, which, as you'll probably remember, was when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? This was said by him in Aramaic, not Greek, as Jesus and the people with him would most likely have spoken Aramaic as their primary day-to-day language. This is what they would have been using at that time. So the reason we see it in bits of the Old Testament is because it was also, even back then, a common language of the Middle Eastern area during this time period. And why we have those parts in Ezra in Aramaic is because these were communications. They're quotes from letters, and we get them preserved in the Bible in their original words. These letters are not being translated into Hebrew, even if all of it, Aramaic and the Hebrew, has obviously been translated in English for us to read today. So Aramaic was an important language during biblical times, and it was really a common language for this part of the world during the time of Daniel. But just like Greek would become the common language, then Latin, and now today, the common language is English. That's what is spoken all around the world. We see throughout world history, there's usually always a language that becomes that universal language that everyone can communicate to each other in, irrespective of where they come from. What's the language of their culture? Which is why this matters here, because the Babylonians spoke Aramaic. And from verse 4 right through to the end of chapter 7, this will now be written in Aramaic and not Hebrew. We can't see it. It's all English to us, but the book is actually 50-50 Hebrew and Aramaic. And why that matters is because it does spread over the chapters of 6 and 7. As said last week, the book is in two halves. We're looking at chapters 1 to 6 now, and then 7 to 12 later on in the year. And you'd naturally assume that if the book was in two languages, it would happen where that natural split in theme is, right? 1 to 6 being in Aramaic, 7 to 12 being in Hebrew. That would be the logical assumption. but it doesn't. That's not actually how it's split. Chapters 1 to chapter 2, verse 3, that we just read then, is in Hebrew. And then chapter 2, verse 4 to the end of chapter 7 is Aramaic. And we then go back to Hebrew for chapters 8 to 12. So it's kind of like a sandwich construction. But because of this, because Aramaic spans this middle part, it shows the unity of the book. And it's not simply an Aramaic book and a Hebrew book that have just been stuck together. That's the important point here. The two languages are spread over the two halves that we're looking at. But besides being just something of interest and just a fact worth knowing, this is still significant to what's going on here. It's worth mentioning as it's not just trivia, because this is, as I said, one of the main languages of the Babylonians. And from this point on, we'll see the conversations Daniel has with the Babylonians in what is their language, and it starts here in verse 4. In fact, in other translations other than what is the current NIV, the start of verse 4 does not simply say, then the astrologers answered the king, because it actually says, like in translations like the ESV, then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, or in an even more literal translation again, like the NASB, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. So what this is simply telling us here is they spoke to him in that local language. This has all been recorded in a language that the locals know. In fact, if you have an older NIV, the one's actually printed on paper, it says Aramaic as well. For some reason, the new version doesn't. I have no idea why they left it out. It's there in the original Hebrew. Pretty much every translation has it, but the new NIV, for whatever reason, doesn't. But the point is, this is now going to be recorded from this point on in the local language. So like watching a movie when they go to another country and they speak to someone that doesn't speak English, and then they keep the original language, you know, French and Japanese or whatever, and they put in subtitles to keep it authentic. Well, it's the same here. It's set in a place where people are speaking Aramaic, so keep that language up until chapter 8, when Daniel will be told to keep the things that are revealed to him in that latter part sealed up. That when he gets told specifically not to make these things known, that is when it goes back to Hebrew, as this stuff's to be revealed to God's people after they've left Babylon. So it switches here from Hebrew because Aramaic is a local language and it's for everyone to know, but then it goes back when the revelation is to be kept from the Babylonians, which is rather significant when we look at what it is that's being revealed in those later chapters. But we'll talk about that next term when we actually get to those sections. But for now, the main thing is what these magicians and sorcerers and astrologers said to the king when they heard this request to have this dream interpreted. So getting back to our passage now, after that side point, we see that they say here in Aramaic to the king in verse 4, may the king live forever. Tell your servants to dream and we will interpret it. And what we immediately see is that the king is no fool, right? He's not going to make it that easy for them, because we read in verse 5, the king replied to the astrologers, this is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll have you cut into pieces and your house is turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me to dream and interpret it for me. So he knows the game that could be played here. Because if he tells them to dream and then they give what is the interpretation of that dream, he's got no way of knowing if they're for real or not. He could tell them to dream and then they could simply say, well, that object in your dream means this. And that image in that dream, that means this. And it's saying that this will happen. And he's got no way of verifying if they know what they're talking about. They could just be making it all up. But if they can tell him to dream first, then it means that they really do have special abilities. They must be genuine because they can essentially read his mind. So with the king being suspicious of them and then not being able to do what he asks, this conversation then goes back and forward with nothing being accomplished. And that is because they simply can't do it, as they know that he would catch them if they just simply tried to guess what the dream is. If they take a stab at this, they're just not going to guess it right. And with them avoiding his request, the king says in verse 9, "You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping that the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I'll know that you can interpret for me." In which they reply in verse 12, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks." And then again in verse 11, "What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." And as they have now basically admitted to not having the abilities that they claim to have, this is why we see it then say, "This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon." So now he believes that all these experts that he pays, that he gives them special positions in the empire, he now believes they're all fake. They claim to have special knowledge when they in reality have nothing. They can't really interpret dreams. They're just like modern day fortune tellers. They're just scam artists. And now that this is obvious to the king, he's just going to kill a lot of them. They're a waste of time. But this anger of the king, it's going to cause issues for what is even innocent people, those not trying to deceive him. Because it says in verse 13, "So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death." So they're now going to get caught up in this as well. But whilst it may seem like a bad situation, it's actually going to be an opportunity. Because we see that God has created this situation to enable Daniel to prove himself and then to rise to a position of power within the empire, but being the only one who can solve the king's problems. Which is why we now get to Daniel's response to this situation. The king has had a dream and he wants the answers, and as no one can give it to him, he now wants to kill all the experts who claimed that they could. But Daniel responds to this as he takes the opportunity to actually do something about it. So we see that after being told in verses 14 to 15 just what the situation is, we see it says in verse 16, "At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him." And then we see that Daniel goes back to his house, he tells his friends about this, and he says to pray for the situation. At this point, Daniel doesn't have the answers, so he says, "Let's pray to God." And then it says in verse 19, "During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision." And then we see this prayer from verse 20, where he says that God gives wisdom and knowledge and reveals the hidden things, and finishes by saying, "I thank you and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what was asked of me. You have made known to us the dream of the king." So Daniel now has the answer to the king's questions, the answer that no one else does. He's literally the only person on earth who can do this. As the magician said, there is no one on earth. Daniel now can. He's now had this revealed to him. Everyone else said it can't be done, but God has miraculously given Daniel the answer he needs to know another person's dreams, to be able to not just interpret a dream, but to know the dream itself. And we see this now all unfold as we get to the second half of our passage this morning. We see in verse 24, Daniel says, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king and I will interpret his dream for him." And then when we go to verse 25, this is exactly what happens, leading to the king's question 26. "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" And as Daniel's answer to this question, which is really the big point for us today, what he says is important for showing us who Daniel is and how someone who really trusts in God would answer that question that's just been asked of him. Because his reply in 27 is not what you'd normally expect from these kind of astrologers, enchanters, and these wise men, because he actually goes on to say, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about, which is really what the king has already been told. No person could do this on their own. It's simply not possible for someone to read minds and know dreams. And Daniel's not going to pretend that he somehow has this miraculous power in himself to be able to do that. However, Daniel then says the important part in verse 28, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. So Daniel's saying, no one can know this, but God can. God knows this mystery, and only he can reveal it. Daniel's not out there to take credit for himself here. He's not out there to build reputation for himself as the special expert who can do impossible things by his own power, which is what you would expect most of these other wise men and magicians to try and do, to try and pass it off that it's all about them. Instead, as he does this, as he reveals the dream and gives the interpretation of the dream, what he's doing as he does this is giving all glory to God for this happening. He gives all credit to him. In fact, he even goes on to spell this out in verse 30. This mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. So God has given Daniel the answer, not because he is greater than others, but it's so the king can have the answer. Something important that he needs to know about God. And that is only so that to ultimately lead the king into seeing the obvious. That the God that he doesn't even believe in, the God that his people have been persecuting, well, that God is in control of all things, even his empire. Even the king's own mind is under this God's power. And that point of God's power becomes very clear when we see just what the interpreter of the dream was all about. Because what this dream shows is God's bigger plan for the world, and how the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar, whilst they think they're significant, they're only a small part of world history. They're not that important. That whilst this king thinks he rules the world, this dream is going to shatter that illusion. Now, we'll get a better understanding of what is being said here when we get into part 2 of this series. We actually see this same thing getting spelled out in what is in more detail later on in the book. So we'll go into this kind of stuff more thoroughly when we get further into Daniel and it focuses on this stuff. But for this passage here and for us this morning, it's worth still having a think about what is being revealed here in this dream, as we now get to see why this dream was so concerning and also how significant it really is for the world. That what's being revealed here is literally world-changing. So we see in verse 31 that the dream was about a statue. That this statue was something massive and amazing. It was incredible. And then as it goes on, we see that each part of the statue is made of a different substance and that these parts each represent something. So we see in 32, it says that the head of the statue was made of gold, that its chest and arms are silver, its belly and thighs are made of bronze, and its legs made of iron. And then finally, the iron of the legs turns into its feet, which are still partly of iron, but also partly of clay. It's a mix. And then what we see is that the feet get hit by a rock that causes them to shatter. And then the rest of the body, the rest of the statue, it's broken as well, only for the wind to blow it all away like it was never even there. And that this rock that hit it, the one that causes all the damage, it says it was not cut out by human hands. And then it ends by saying, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So that's the dream. A statue of several substances with each part being smashed into dust, and then the rock that smashed it, that came from something not human, that rock then goes on and it fills the world. So you can see it's a very specific dream when you look at the details, but you can also see it's very cryptic. It's very hard to understand what this could possibly mean. And clearly one that the experts, they had no chance of guessing this, as it's a very unusual vision. They could never have figured this out without God's revelation of what it is and what it means. But with all the imagery now known, Daniel now tells the king what it does all mean. That it's not just random thoughts, but it's actually a glimpse of the future given to the king by God himself. So Daniel now says in 37:38, Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. Followed by what is now the key part, where he then finishes verse 38 by saying, You are the head of gold. So on the statue of different parts, Babylon is the head. That's what it represents, that the king and his kingdom are the head of the statue in the dream, and it's gold. It's the most precious and pure and valuable of metals. But then as he goes on to say, after you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there'll be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. For iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. So these different parts of the statue are in fact different kingdoms. Kingdoms that are yet to come at this point of time in world history. And each kingdom will eventually be more powerful than the one before it. Stronger than the one. The metals get stronger until you get to iron, but becoming less glamorous. Right? First gold, then silver, then bronze. Like at any competition, as you go down the order, the winner gets gold, but as you go down, it becomes less valuable. And then finally, iron. No one would want an iron medal. It would mean nothing. So each is being inferior to the one before it, even if it's maybe getting stronger as we go on. And now that we today, here we are, 2023, now that we're on the other side of all this, well, many have tried to work this out. They've looked back at history and how different empires line up with what we see here. And for the most part, we can actually do a pretty good job of figuring this out. It's actually pretty obvious, especially when we take what is said in latter chapters of this book into account as well. We get more information later on in the Bible that actually mentions by name what some of these empires are. So just to quickly explain what the assumptions are. The head of gold we know represents the Babylonian Empire, which was ruled by Nebuchadnezzar at the time of the dream. That one's easy. It actually says it right here. We get that one spelt out. But as we know, the Persians conquered Babylon, just as we saw at the end of chapter 1 last week, as Daniel lives to see Cyrus become king. So the chest and arms of the statue, which are made of silver, well, they most likely represent that Persian Empire. It was the next empire to come that conquered the Babylonians. And then as we move down, we see that the belly and thigh of the statue is the third empire, which was made of bronze. And that this would represent the Greek Empire led by Alexander the Great, which then conquered the Persian Empire. And then finally, the legs of the statue, which are made of iron. Well, this most likely represents the Roman Empire that took over everything. Because as it says here, as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. So we can go through history, look at what happened after this, and we can see that this dream was really talking about things to come. It's cryptic at this point, as even the interpretation Daniel gives was not really specific other than say, your empire will one day fall, and then the one after that, and the one after that as well. But there is enough here to know that this was a massive revelation of what was to come and how it's all part of God's bigger plan. And that becomes very clear when we get to what is the final part, the feet, the part that was first destroyed. And the feet, if you remember, were a mix of iron and clay, which is why he says in 41, this will be a divided kingdom. And then says in 42 and 43, as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. And it's hard to know for sure what this part represents, but it seems very likely that it's still linked to that fourth empire. It's the final one, so it could very well be talking about what Rome became. Because we know Rome was very unstable, it was made up of many cultures that never mixed, so it would be both iron, strength, but also brittle, iron mixed with clay. And as Jesus said, a kingdom divided against itself will be brought to destruction. So this empire, the final one, it will collapse. Like all things of the devil, it has no unity, and that will eventually be its undoing. But whatever these really represent, this is a part we can know for sure. The point is that the kingdoms of this earth will come and go, and that God is in control of all of them, and he will destroy all of them. Because it then says in verse 44, in the time of those kings, most likely saying the kings of the last empire, right? The ones of Rome. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. And then he brings that back to imagery mentioned before about what crushes the statue that represents all these kingdoms that were yet to come. Because he then says here, in regards to that kingdom, it will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that breaks the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. So we're seeing that these worldly kingdoms, they'll come and go as God brings them down, and then at the end, his kingdom will replace them all. And in the time of this last kingdom, his kingdom will arise that will destroy it, and it will replace it with an eternal kingdom that never ends. And of course, it's this point that fits in very much with the imagery in the New Testament. That this is what is going on when Jesus brings his kingdom during the time of this brittle, falling, divided Roman Empire. Because when we think of how Jesus described himself, he quoted from things like Psalm 118. And he said this in Matthew 21:42, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this and it's marvelous in our eyes. And then on top of that, he then links himself with this cornerstone, as he also said, anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. And of course, this was indicating that he was the stone that crushes the things of this world. The ones who oppose him will fall on him. He'll destroy them. And this idea, right, it is repeated many times. This is a big theme of the New Testament. We see Peter talks about it in 1 Peter 2:6-8, and also in Acts 4:11 when he was called before the Jewish leaders. In Ephesians 2:20, Paul says, when talking about the kingdom, God's kingdom, the kingdom of Christ that will come, that it will have Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. And then when we look at his parables, the parables of Jesus, of the kingdom he is bringing, and how he compares it to a mustard seed that grows bigger than the rest, or how it's like the yeast that works all the way through the dough. The image is always of something starting very small, which it was. You know, he brought it. He was the first one to bring that message, and it goes from person to person. It grows and it grows. The church grows and it grows until it takes over the entire world, until Jesus is king of the world. And just like the rock here that struck the statue and became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth, all the imagery of Jesus and of his kingdom is of that, filling the world. That he's the rock, the stone that crushes empires, and he will set up his own kingdom, a kingdom that will last forever. Which is why it ends here in verse 45, saying, the great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. So this is God's big plan being revealed. Like how it was revealed to Habakkuk of what he planned for Judah and how he would send the Babylonians to conquer them. Well, now the message is the Babylonian Empire will fall. And so will the next. And so will the one after that. As God's going to bring them all down, one after the other, and he's going to replace them with his own kingdom, his eternal kingdom. And as we know from the New Testament, Jesus will be the king of that new kingdom, the king of the eternal kingdom that lasts forever. He'll be the eternal king of it. But what that means is that even back here, right, 500 years, half a millennia before Jesus came, well, his gospel message was already being proclaimed. And it's being proclaimed directly to the king of Babylon in his own language. It's in Aramaic for the Babylonians to know. that a big part of what Daniel is doing here, it's not just getting God's people ready to return home one day, but also making God known to their captors as well in the meantime. Which is what makes this last part of the passage so important. Because having given this glimpse of the future and God's gospel message being revealed, we now see what is the king's response. How the king responded to the interpretation of what was his very disturbing dream. So it says in verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and said, and paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. So we see here that God is being glorified by what is the very enemy of God's people. Even with such a powerful revelation that his kingdom will one day fall, Nebuchadnezzar sees the power of God as something to respect and give honor to. And because Daniel speaks for God, we now see Daniel given great responsibilities in the empire. It goes on to say in verse 48, then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. And what is significant for what we're talking about today is that we see that when Daniel got in that position, well, the first thing he did was use that power to get others who worship God in high positions as well. Because it says, moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So we said that Daniel is promoted and he uses his position to make sure his friends are promoted too. And by all this, by Daniel taking the opportunity to interpret a dream and trusting God through it all, well, suddenly those who have just recently been carted off into exile, but are now basically running the place. They've now got the highest positions in Babylon. So God gave them the opportunity to take these places, and they have faithfully taken them. They didn't run, nor did they deflect attention from their faith to try and avoid any risks they might face. Instead, when the opportunity came, they did all that they could to make God and his ways known. And that is really the big thing here. The lesson we get from this and the example we are shown. Because it said at the start, the question for us is that when faced with a hostile society, and when living in a time when our faith will be tested, will we confidently profess our faith and point towards God as the foundation of our strength, or will we just avoid the conflict? Right? When faced with difficulty, do we in faith take the opportunities to glorify God, the opportunities in which he gives us, or do we run away from them or even deny our relationship with him altogether? Because that is the test for all those who have faith when living in a hostile world that rejects God's ways and is also hostile to even those who are just simply proclaiming his ways, trying to live by it. It's a test that Peter failed when he denied Jesus 3 times, or when Jonah failed when he was sent to Nineveh to proclaim God's will there, and yet he ran completely in the other direction. So what we need to do is make sure that we do take the opportunities when they're given to us, and then when we take those opportunities, then point to God through them. To know that God will give us those opportunities, and if we just stop to look for them, we'll see that they really are around us, and especially as our society distances itself more from God and becomes more surprised by what we believe and what we have to say, it is then, in that moment, that we really become the light in the dark, but only as long as we're pointed towards God. As long as we're making it clear what it is we believe and making sure that he is glorified. And when that time comes, we can confidently do that, because as we see here in the dream, well, God's kingdom was a long time coming. That no matter where our society heads, Jesus will return. So there's no need to fear glorifying God, even in a hostile world, because ultimately History is written. That was the message of the dream to Nebuchadnezzar here. Doesn't matter what he does. One day, his empire will fall, as will the next ones after him. And they'll fall because God's kingdom will destroy them all, and that's the one that will never come to an end. And if we have faith in that, then telling that person at work what you believe, or inviting that friend to church and letting them know who God is, it's not that big a sacrifice, right? We can take the opportunities which are given to us to let God's will be known to the world around us, to glorify him, because as Daniel showed here, in those moments, it's really got nothing to do with our abilities, nothing to do with our strength, but it's simply having faith in God's strength and what God can do. Trusting that God will set up his kingdom that will last forever. Trusting that he is actually in control of all things.